The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of Ouagadougou as Colonel Ibrahim Traore stood at the window of his office, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on the massive bronze letters that would spell out Stade Lionel Messi above the entrance to what had been, until yesterday, the national stadium of Burkina Faso. "You've lost your mind, Ibrahim," came a voice from behind him. General Amadou Sankara, no relation to the revolutionary leader but bearing his name with fierce pride, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "The council is in uproar. Half want to stage a counter-coup over a football stadium." Traore turned slowly, his weathered face betraying nothing of the storm brewing within. At 34, he was the youngest military leader in West Africa, having seized power 18 months ago amid promises of Pan-African unity and economic independence. The decision to rename the stadium had been impulsive, made during a restless night when sleep eluded him and the weight of leadership pressed down like the harmattan winds. Messi transcends nations, Amadou. He represents excellence, determination, the rise from nothing to everything. Isn't that what we're fighting for? He's Argentine, for God's sake. Sankara's voice rose. "We overthrew a government that bowed to foreign interests, and now you're naming our most sacred sporting ground after a South American millionaire?" The argument had been raging for 3 days now, ever since Traore made the announcement on national radio. The military council, a collection of colonels and generals who had supported the coup, was fracturing along unexpected lines. Some saw it as a betrayal of African values, others as a progressive embrace of global football culture. The people, meanwhile, were divided between those who worshipped Messi's genius and those who felt their national identity was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Traore walked to his desk and picked up a worn photograph of himself as a 10-year-old boy, kicking a deflated football in the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso. "I watched the 2022 World Cup final with my nephew. When Messi lifted that trophy, tears streaming down his face, I saw something I recognized. The burden of carrying your people's dreams, the weight of expectation, the loneliness of leadership. Poetry won't save your presidency, Ibrahim." Sankara moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Colonel Zubga has been meeting with the French ambassador. He's promising to reverse the stadium decision if Paris backs a new government." The news hit Traore like a physical blow. Jean-Baptiste Zubga had been his closest ally during the coup, a man he'd trusted with his life. The thought of French interference in what should have been a purely domestic matter filled him with the familiar rage that had driven him to power in the first place. "Let him try," Traore said, though his confidence was manufactured. "The people will decide." But the people were as divided as the military council. In the markets of Ouagadougou, vendors argued over whether honoring Messi was inspired or insane. The youth, raised on Barcelona highlights and Champions League dreams, largely supported the decision. The older generation, veterans of independence struggles and witnesses to decades of foreign exploitation, saw it as cultural surrender. Marie Compere, a schoolteacher who had lived through 3 coups and 2 civilian governments, summed up the sentiment in the main market: "We name our children after our ancestors, not after foreign football players." What's next? Renaming our capital after Ronaldo? The crisis deepened when FIFA's president released a statement expressing concern about the politicization of football infrastructure. The African Union called for measured dialogue, while social media erupted with hashtags both supporting and condemning the decision. Hashtag Messi Stadium and hashtag Africa First trended globally, turning a local controversy into international theater. At the French embassy, Ambassador Philippe Dubois met with Colonel Zubga in a room that smelled of expensive cologne and political desperation. Maps of West Africa covered the walls, each marked with colored pins representing French economic interests. The ambassador's fingers drummed against the mahogany table as he spoke. "Your president has become unpredictable, Colonel. First, he expels our mining companies, then he embraces Russian military advisors, and now this spectacle with the Argentine footballer. Paris is concerned about stability in the region." Zubga, a mountain of a man with scars from his days as a paratrooper, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ibrahim was always impulsive, but this decision has no strategic value. It's pure ego, a distraction from real governance. Indeed. Du Bois leaned forward. France has always valued stability in Burkina Faso. We have investments to protect, relationships to maintain. A change in leadership might be refreshing. The conversation continued for another hour, with coded language and diplomatic euphemisms masking what was essentially a discussion of regime change. Zubga left the embassy with assurances of French support and a Swiss bank account number written on embassy letterhead. Meanwhile, across the city, Traore's support was crumbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Islamic scholars who had initially supported the coup began questioning a leader who would honor a non-Muslim over the nation's own heroes. The labor unions, suspicious of any leader who seemed more interested in football than factory conditions, withdrew their endorsement. Even the market women, who had celebrated when Traore overthrew the previous government, now whispered about his priorities. "He thinks he's Messi," laughed Fatima Ouagadougou, a cloth seller whose political opinions carried weight in the capital. "But Messi wins games. What has our colonel won except arguments?" The international reaction was swift and predictable. The European Union issued a statement about democratic values and cultural sensitivity. The United States ambassador called for dialogue and respect for local traditions. Russia, through its Wagner Group representatives, offered quiet support for Traore's decision, seeing an opportunity to position themselves as champions of African sovereignty against Western cultural imperialism. In the presidential palace, Traore found himself increasingly isolated. His daily intelligence briefings painted a picture of a government losing legitimacy over what many considered a trivial matter. The economy was struggling, unemployment was rising, and the security situation in the north remained precarious. Yet all anyone wanted to discuss was the name of a football stadium. "Mr. President," said his chief of staff, a nervous young man named Gustave Caboret, "the Brazilian ambassador has requested a meeting. Apparently, some of their football officials are interested in the gesture." Traore almost laughed. "So now we're getting support from Brazil. What's next?" A telegram from Barcelona. The meeting with the Brazilian ambassador proved more substantial than expected. Ambassador Carlos Santos arrived with a proposal that caught Traore off guard. Brazil would sponsor a youth football academy at the stadium, complete with coaches, equipment, and scholarships for promising players. The gesture would transform the controversy into a concrete development project. "Messi may be Argentine," Santos explained over coffee in the palace garden, "but football is universal. Your vision of honoring excellence regardless of nationality resonates with our own history. Brazil has always been a melting pot of cultures and dreams." For the first time in days, Traore felt a glimmer of hope. The Brazilian proposal offered a way to reframe the debate from cultural betrayal to international cooperation. But it also raised new questions about sovereignty and dependence that he wasn't sure he was prepared to answer. That evening, 3 days before the stadium's official inauguration, Traore convened an emergency session of the Military Council. The meeting room in the presidential palace had seen countless power struggles, but none quite like this. 15 uniformed men sat around a mahogany table, their faces reflecting the deep divisions tearing at the heart of the government. "The question before us is simple," Traore began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Are we leaders or followers? Do we make decisions based on conviction or convenience?" Colonel Zubga, fresh from his meeting with the French ambassador, leaned forward. "The question is whether we're African leaders or global celebrities. This stadium represents our sovereignty, our identity. To name it after a foreigner is to admit we have no heroes of our own." "Thomas Sankara Stadium," suggested General Caboret, the eldest member of the council. "Or Yanenga Stadium, after our founding queen. Names that speak to our soul, not our aspirations to be European." "Messi isn't European," interjected Colonel Ouagadougou, one of Traore's few remaining allies. "He's from Argentina, a country that also struggled against colonialism, also fought for its place in the world. Maybe that's exactly why he resonates with our people." The debate grew heated. Major Traore, no relation to the president, stood and paced the room. My own son asked me yesterday if this means we're not proud to be Burkinabe anymore. How do I answer that? How do I explain that we're honoring a foreign athlete while our own Olympic medalists live in poverty? Because, the president said quietly, sometimes inspiration comes from unexpected places. When I was a child, I didn't dream of being a soldier. I dreamed of being like Pelé, like Maradona, like the great players who showed the world that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. General Sankara shook his head. Your childhood dreams are not government policy, Ibrahim. We have real problems to solve. The teachers are on strike, the hospitals lack medicine, the roads are falling apart. And we're debating football stadiums. Maybe that's exactly why we need this, Traore replied. Maybe our people need something to believe in, something to inspire them beyond the daily struggles. Messi represents the possibility of greatness, the idea that someone from humble beginnings can conquer the world through dedication and skill. The argument continued for hours, with voices rising and falling like the tide. Some council members stormed out, others called for immediate votes of no confidence. By evening, Traore realized his government was on the brink of collapse over a matter that had started as a simple gesture of admiration. As the meeting broke up in acrimony, Traore walked alone through the palace gardens, past the fountains installed by the French colonial administration and the statues erected by successive independent governments. Each ruler had tried to leave his mark, to shape the national narrative according to his vision. Now he was discovering the cost of that ambition. His phone buzzed with a text from his nephew, the same boy with whom he'd watched the World Cup final. Uncle, the kids at school are calling me Little Messi because of the stadium. I scored 3 goals today. Thank you for believing in dreams. That message, more than any political calculation, crystallized Traore's thinking. In a country where hope was often in short supply, where young people saw their futures constrained by poverty and limited opportunities, perhaps the greatest gift a leader could give was the permission to dream beyond geographical boundaries. The next morning, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou, Traore made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He called a press conference for that afternoon, announcing that the stadium would be renamed Stade Lionel Messi, Excellence Stadium, with sections dedicated to football legends from around the world, including Messi, but also featuring African stars like Samuel Eto'o, Didier Drogba, and Abedi Pelé. Excellence has no nationality, he told the gathered journalists and military officials. It speaks a universal language that transcends borders, cultures, and politics. This stadium will honor greatness wherever it emerges, while remaining fundamentally African in its heart and soul. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it prevented the government from falling apart over a football stadium. Colonel Zubga's coup plot fizzled when the French ambassador, reading the changing political winds, withdrew support. The opposition parties, robbed of their most inflammatory talking point, returned to more mundane criticisms of economic policy and military spending. 6 months later, as Traore watched Burkina Faso's national team play their first match in Excellence Stadium, he reflected on the strange crisis that had nearly toppled his government. The stadium was packed, the crowd was electric, and the players seemed inspired by the new venue. The Brazilian Youth Academy was taking shape, with young players training on pitches that bore the names of football legends from 6 continents. When Burkina Faso scored in the final minute to secure a crucial victory, the entire stadium erupted in celebration. In that moment, with 30,000 voices raised in joy, Traore understood that identity wasn't about rejecting the world, it was about engaging with it on your own terms, finding your place in the global community while never forgetting where you came from. The bronze letters spelling, Stade Lionel Excellence, gleamed in the floodlights, and for the first time in months, Colonel Ibrahim Traore smiled without reservation. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from compromise, not from division, but from the courage to find unity in the most unlikely places. In a world increasingly defined by walls and boundaries, perhaps the most revolutionary act was simply to dream beyond them.